All right, so I guess I'm going to get started since time for me to start. My name is Sean Ainsley, and I am the webmaster here at AB Tech. I also I do freelance work under a company called Alpha Omega Design, but that is a lot of WordPress work. I do Drupal for the college. Don't hate me because I said WordPress, but it's okay if you do, I don't care. But there's a link to the presentation. There's a Dropbox link. You can download the PDF of the presentation if you need to. So we're going to talk about Angular today, and I got a little GIF going. Sometimes, you find a solution for something, and you kind of feel like the guy that caught this ball right here. You're like yeah, I got that. And so sometimes when I stumbled upon Angular, it was kind of like that. It was like, man, this is really cool. This is a good solution. I'm real interested in REST APIs and getting data into a website from another source, not necessarily out of the database. So Angular's pretty cool. So if you're an advanced, has anybody here used Angular before? Okay. If you're an advanced Angular user, this may be covering some of the basics for you. You may not get a whole lot out of it. Don't leave. You're welcome to stay. I had somebody tell me one time that a good coach always goes over the basics. So you may hear some things like, that you already know. You may hear some things that are new. I don't know. But so this is for new to intermediate Angular users, and we're going to go over a lot of the stuff that Angular is made of, and at the very end, we're going to go over some ways that we could use Angular. And by the way, the previous session was awesome because I write Angular using Typescript, and so it uses ES6 functionality. So a lot of the stuff we just heard, you'll see in these code snippets. So Angular, what is Angular? It's one framework, mobile and desktop. That's what it is. That's their definition of it. You can actually use Angular with native script and convert it into a native app, which I think is cool. You can use Ionic too, but that's what it is. All right, so Angular is written in TypeScript, but you don't have to write TypeScript. You can write Angular in JavaScript or Dart. I prefer to use TypeScript because it has some features that I like with typing. All right, so this is kind of a sketch of an Angular 2 application and some of the pieces that are in it that we're going to talk about today. There's a lot more than what's on this diagram, on this image. And this came from their architecture page. A lot of the stuff I'm going to reference today is in their documentation, their architecture documentation. So if you really want to dig into this, I recommend just digging through the documentation on the site and going through it. There's lots of good stuff for you there. But some of the parts we're going to cover today are modules and components, directives. We're going to cover metadata, templates, data binding, services, dependency injection, and routing and navigation. So modules. We heard a little bit about modules in the previous talk. We'll hear more about this later probably. But a typical module is just a cohesive block of code dedicated to a single purpose. And it typically exports something of value in that code, such one thing, typically a class. So that's you can think of it as it's a module. It's a piece of something that you would add together as a building block to build a larger application. Angular is modular, and so we heard about, there was a reference to modules, I think, in the presentation we just heard. And so Angular modules are not JavaScript modules. There's differences. We're going to look at those. Angular has its own modularity system. It's commonly referred to as ng modules. So if you see ng module, that's Angular's module system. So here's what a Angular module looks like. And if you notice the @ng module decorator there, that is really the difference between the Angular. That metadata right there is really the difference between the Angular module and the JavaScript module here. Now, we're importing ng module from Angular core, but it's not used as a decorator in this instance. And then we have the import and export keywords that we saw in the previous presentation, part of ES6. The signature of a JavaScript module. And in JavaScript, each file is a module. And all objects defined in that file belong to that module. So that's another important distinction. So they're two different things. They're complementary to each other. And it's what we use to write Angular apps. Components. So if you work with Angular, you will write a lot of components. So we're gonna, and they control a piece of what would be called a view. So this is a component class. Export class. There's the export keyword again. This is actually incomplete. We'll talk about complete Angular component in the next few slides. This requires metadata to make it complete. So what the metadata does is it tells Angular how to process this thing. So we put the component decorator on it and provide it with the metadata required, and then Angular knows what to do with it. So this is actually what you would see in a component. You define a selector, template URL, define providers, and then you would export out the class. There's some other imports that would be at the top of this file, but this is really focused on the component here. So the component without the metadata is actually just a class. There are different, so the add component is known as a decorator. There's different types of decorators. So there's add input, add output, add injectable, add pipe. And the various types of decorators have different configuration options, which you can find in the Angular documentation. So if you want to use a decorator in one of your components, then you can find the information on what metadata needs to go inside of that decorator. Another interesting fact about a component is that it's technically a directive. So it's a directive with a template, technically. And a directive class is a class with directive metadata. If that seems kind of redundant. And so the add component decorator is just an add directive decorator extended with template-oriented features. There's a couple other types of directives while we're talking about them. Structural directives, they alter layout by adding, removing, replacing elements in the DOM. Like you'll see ng for or ng if in the Angular template files. And those are structural directives. In addition, you'll see attribute directives, and they alter the appearance or behavior of an existing element. In templates, they look like regular HTML attributes, hence the name. So you'll see something equals, in this case, it's the ng model. So that's an attribute directive. It looks like an attribute, an HTML attribute. So they're pretty easy to pick out. Then we have templates. So the template is what we use to display a component's view. So component, in the previous slides, there was a template URL in the metadata that we defined. And so that template URL would point to this file. And this is the way we control the view of that component. So and templates are made up of HTML and Angular syntax. So here's a template file. And you could also do I'm losing the word right now, but you can do the backtick template inside of the component file. What's the what? Inline. You can do an inline right inside of the component file if you had just a small bit of code. You didn't need to put it in an external file. But this would be an external file that you would reference with template URL metadata. And so this has ng4. It's got some stuff in it. Some HTML elements that you probably recognize, H2, the paragraph tag. And then it's got some weird stuff, the ng4 and the click and the parentheses. And it's got these double curly braces with this awesome.way. And so that's some HTML mixed with some Angular. And that's what you're going to see when you're looking at Angular code. You're going to see this kind of stuff. And that the double curly braces, you're going to see that a lot. That's the way that you would get values into the template from a component. So component templates can be nested, so you can have components use other components. So you can nest it to make a real rich application. You can have a lot of functionality. It doesn't all have to be in the same place. It's still this modular idea. You can see they even drawn out its little blocks, you know. And so that's good because we can keep things small and manageable even in a large application. Data binding. Woohoo! All right. So data binding is a method for coordinating parts of the template with parts of the component. The way for us to coordinate what's happening there. I like to think of it as like a pipe, so we can have information travel back and forth from the component to the template. So there's 4 different ways of data binding. And there's 3 flows that data can take. So you can have data come from as a value from a component. You can also have you can just have a property value come from a component. You have an event go to a component. Or you can have what's called two-way binding, which is the last one where it can flow both directions. So bidirectional. And then here's the proper names for that stuff. Interpolation, the awesome.way inside of the curly brackets. Property binding is when we have the way and we're assigning the selected way to it. Event binding, we have that function method assigned to the click event. So that's going to do some stuff whenever that click happens. And then we have the two-way binding, which is common on inputs. You see two-way binding typically on an input element. Services. Do some work. We love services. So this is services are what we use to do something. I mean, so there's lots of things like HTTP requests, loggers, get an image for a blog post for 1,000 posts or whatever. Those kind of things you wouldn't want to put in your component and have every component doing an HTTP request. That doesn't make it's not efficient. So we would create a service that runs an HTTP request, and then we would call that service in our component and use it that way. Kind of like this example here. So this is a HTTP request. service that would go out to a URL. Looks like it would be on this server, but and get the way that Drupal camp is awesome, I think. Yep, and return that to us. And then you would just call this service inside of your component, and then use the information that's returned instead of writing this inside of your component and bloating your component. And we see that let keyword here. So this is the scope to that function. With TypeScript, we write ES6, so it's awesome. So we can use those things. Services are for the things our components should not be doing. So it shouldn't be getting data from the server, shouldn't be validating forms, shouldn't be logging. Shouldn't be doing a repetitive task, right? So if we have something that's repetitive, we should probably put that in a service so that we don't have our component doing that work. It doesn't need to. And then another key feature is dependency injection. So this is a way to supply a new instance of a class with the fully formed dependencies it requires. Most dependencies are services. So I'm just talking about services, and now we're talking about dependency injection. This is a way that Angular can use to provide new components with the services they need. In a constructor, we tell Angular what services a component needs. And so we might say private awesome is an awesomeness service. And so Angular, at that point, knows we need the awesomeness service. And so it's going to look in the constructor, see that, and then it's going to use the provider we find either in app.module.ts, or we can define a provider on a component level right inside the component in the metadata that we talked about that's in the add component decorator. And so it's going to find that for us, and then it's going to look inside of the injector container to see if it already has an instance of that service. So if it's already got an instance of that service, it'll return that. If it does not have an instance of that service, it will create that and put it in the container and then return it. And so then once everything that's been requested has been resolved and returned, then Angular will tell will call the components constructor. So it's not going to construct anything, and this will throw an error. If you don't have a provider defined and you do this, it's going to throw an error and tell you there's not a provider. And if you see that, then you should start looking at what services you're using. So once everything's there, then it will call the constructor with those services as arguments. So here's some things to remember about dependency injection. This came off of the architecture page. I thought it seemed pretty important, so I grabbed it. And this is dependency injection is wired to the Angular framework and used everywhere. The injector is the main mechanism. The injector maintains a container of service instances that it created. So it maintains that for you. You don't need to maintain that. That's awesome. The injector can create a new service instance from a provider. And then providers are a recipe for creating a service. And then we register providers with the injectors. So routing and navigation. This is a big topic. It's a huge topic. Angular does not come with routing. There's a package that you have to. So you can have an Angular application and not include the routing package and not use routing if you wanted to. But it is so there's a component router that you can include into your files and have routing services. And so we're going to look at a couple of the key pieces to routing that you need to know, like if you're just going to start up and get going with Angular and doing some routing. I thought it was pretty cool the way it works. But in most cases, you should define a base URL for your application. I know my Angular application, the app folder is not in the root. So I need to define, I had to define this in order to get my routing to work properly. So that's something you have to watch for. And then you'll need a app.router.ts with your routing config in it. And this enables you to connect like paths of the URL and the URL with components that you want to load when somebody hits that URL. So if we want, so for DCABL-awesome, if somebody visits that on our website, we want to use the DCABL-awesome component to handle that request and possibly return some information. We can have parameters in our path. So if you notice the path that says awesome/:way, so that :way is a parameter that we could feed in and pull that back out into the component later and use that. So we can go ahead and define, if we know we're going to have a parameter in the URL, we can go ahead and define that here, and it'll be expecting that. And of course, we're exporting it back out. We're importing and exporting here. And then you would need to import your routing into app.module.ts. So then once you create your routing configuration, you'll need to make sure that you import that into your module, your Angular module. And so that's this import. We'll import routing and app routing providers from the same directory, app.routing, which would be a .js file. And we just leave the in the previous talk, it was mentioned just leave the file extension off when we're importing. It doesn't. In the configuration, we define what the default file extension is. So we define it as JS, and it doesn't. It knows that, and we don't have to add it here. And we see our ng model decorator, and then we have we can declare our imports, and one of them happens to be routing. And then we're going to declare the app routing providers as a provider for our application. And so so that right there will get you off the ground and running with routing. And then there's a ton of other documentation and information. If you go to the routing and navigation page on Angular's website, the scroll bar is about that tall. There's just a ton of documentation. There's all kinds of stuff that deals with routing that you can go learn. And I would recommend doing it in any of this. Just dig into the docs, and there's lots of good resources online. If you're interested in getting started with Angular, I'd say go to their website. They have a getting started on GitHub, I think. You can just go clone that repo, get started with it. And so now we're all looking like this. Like, what are we supposed to do with this? But that's okay. So on the last slide, I want to give some resources again, but I want to talk about some use cases, because really I want to inspire you to get started looking into Angular, or even thinking about Angular and using that with your applications and Drupal. But I want to look at some use cases and some ideas. I think that this kind of technology in general, and I'm speaking on Angular, but not just Angular. There's lots of technologies available that kind of do similar things that I think is really interesting, the way the web is evolving and the way that we're able to separate these pieces and share this data that's out there for us to grab. And so some use case examples that I just thought of was one, to use content from other systems. And this could be HTTP, this could be a REST API, or another kind of flavor of API or whatever. There's somebody giving a talk here about the IoT stuff and pulling data into a Drupal site from like controllers and stuff, from building systems and stuff. And so that kind of thing is like, okay, you could do that with some Angular stuff. You could do that with any framework, and pull that into your site and do some dynamic, cool, rich stuff with it. You could have interactive dynamic sections of your pages that you could do all kinds of crazy stuff with. You could run headless. You could run your Drupal site headless and use Angular as the front end. The thing about that, so that's a big task. So when you pull out, if you run a Drupal site, Drupal backend, Angular front end, you're throwing away all the goodness that Drupal has, or some of the goodness that Drupal has provided for you, and all the concerns are then at that point yours. And so that's a large undertaking, but it's a cool idea to be able to do that. You could pop that Angular off, and use another framework on that same back end, and not have to worry about being bound by templating or theming. So that's cool. You would be bound by API documentation and following that, but you're always going to be bound by something. Let's face it. But you can use Angular along with NativeScript or Ionic, use the data from a Drupal 8 site, and build a mobile application. And then I'm sure there's a ton of other things that will come out that people will start doing with these technologies, that we're going to be like, oh wow, yeah, I didn't think about that. That's awesome, And so I guarantee we're going to see these kinds of ideas and stuff coming from people around these JavaScript technologies, Angular, React, Ember, and some of the other ones. But there is one thing right now that is happening, and after I get done speaking, Matt Davis is going to talk about this. But so we have partially decoupled blocks. It has an Angular submodule, so you can take a little bit of what we just learned, dig into some documentation, and go play around with that thing and see how it works. And I think it's really cool. You can take that block and dump it into your Drupal site, and use the component syntax. I've been playing around with it, and I'm into HTTP. I'm into pulling content from other places. So I've been playing around with it, working on a HTTP request component, and so I was able to pull content in from another site. Just dynamically display it in the content region of a Drupal 8 site. Awesome. So it's cool. But so there's the GitHub for it is right there. And then the Drupal project. I believe the issue queue, if you want to help with the issues, I believe you go to GitHub for that, for those issues. But Matt will be talking about that directly after this, which is spectacular. And he's probably going to dig a little bit deeper into Angular too, because I think a large part of their focus in that project has been with Angular. So here's some resources. Typescript documentation, Angular Quick Start. That's a good way to just dive right in. And then the developer guide. And then Angular Universal, which is a really cool idea that provides server-side rendering. So you could render your template server-side and then serve up static HTML. And then NativeScript, which is uses Angular to compile native mobile applications. And they say, I haven't used it yet, but they say it doesn't have some of the restrictions that other JavaScript native apps like phones have. But go try that out. And that's all I've got. If anybody's got any questions, I'll take some questions. And that was my blazing fast Angular talk. First time I gave that presentation, so I wasn't sure how much to put in it, but I think we're a little bit early. So if anybody has any questions, want to talk about anything, cars, hiking, Angular, whatever, I'm up for it. If not, then yeah, we're done. So the question was, are there clear advantages to using Angular over something like Backbone? Backbone is a skeleton framework. It's not going to provide a lot of the stuff. You would have to write a lot of the stuff that Angular provides. For me, Angular is up quickly, in my opinion. You can get up to speed quickly, do what you need to do, and it, like he said, by default, lazy loads what you need. React is another solution that's out there that's kind of it's what a lot of people like, but a lot of that is a lot of the stuff that Angular has is not there. You have to write that. It's like really just like a view layer. All the rest of it's a view. But a lot of people love it. But do what? Yeah. So it's and it really just happened to be the one that I fell on, really, and started using and liked, and a lot of people use React or Ember, or, there's other frameworks. And tomorrow there will be a new next big JavaScript framework out for us to use, and it's going to be something weird. It's going to be wall.js or some lobster.js. But yeah. So, any more questions? Awesome. Go play with some Angular, do some stuff. Let's help Matt.